Today we're going to be talking about graphing absolute value equations and inequalities. So we're going to start with an absolute value equation. And one way to graph it is by using a table of values. So I'm going to take all of the x values here and substitute it, and the output is our y value. And then I'm going to go ahead and plot those points. -2, 2, and so on. Hopefully you're already familiar with the shape of an absolute value graph. But just in case you're not, it's always going to be this V shape. Now when you connect the points, make sure you put an arrow on the end of these rays because this graph keeps going. So here's an example for you to do. What I want you to take note is after you come up with a table of values, and I would say go ahead and use the same values from -2 to 2. I want you to try to figure out what happens to the graph if we have the same exact thing and we just tack a +4 on the end of it. Here's another one for you to try. Same thing, except I would not use -2 to 2. Instead, go ahead and graph it so that you have 3, 0 as your center. Try that. And again, you'll kind of see what that does to the graph. I'm hoping you'll be able to figure out what happens depending on how we change the equation. So I'm going to graph this one for you, and because I'm already familiar with what happens where, I'm going to show you what this graph looks like. And this winds up being sort of flipped. And I could tell that just by looking at the equation. And so another thing I want you to try to think about is, what do you think happened just by what I changed in the equation? So I'm going to go ahead and connect these again with rays because this graph keeps going. So now we get into absolute value inequalities, and the only difference is I have an inequality symbol instead of an equal sign. But the procedure is pretty much the same. You can go ahead and use a table of values since you're not familiar yet with how to graph this, but lucky for you, I am. So I'm going to just see what we have here, and I'm going to think about where I'm going to put the center just by looking at this equation. And I know that I'm going to need to put the vertex of this absolute value graph at the point 3, 5. And again, I don't expect you to know how to do this yet. However, we are certainly going to be talking about this in class. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and graph this. Now, this is kind of the same deal as when we graphed inequalities when we had an equal sign here. When we didn't have the absolute value and we were just graphing the lines. If I just have a less than symbol, it's going to be a dashed line that makes up the graph. If it's a less than or equal to sign, it's going to be a solid line for the graph, and it's still going to be this V-shaped graph. I'm going to go ahead and pull up a dashed line. And we're still going to have this V shape to it. And again, I don't expect you to know how I came up with the vertex being at 3, 5, but I'm hoping you can kind of look at the inequality and see where I'm getting these numbers from. Notice it is +3 instead of -3 though. And we'll talk about this more in class as to how when you manipulate the equation or inequality, you kind of can figure out where the vertex goes. So from here I need to do some shading. So same kind of deal, we're going to shade the graph because it's an inequality, but it's an absolute value inequality. So I'm either going to be shading above the dashed line or below the dashed line. And I would do the same exact procedure as what we talked about with graphing inequalities, where I'm going to pick a point. If this line of the graph does not go through the origin, go ahead and pick the origin. It's just an easier easier numbers to work with. So I'm going to plug in 0, 0 into the original equation. So that gives me, or inequality, 0 is less than absolute value of 0 minus 3. And so this will be the absolute value of negative 3, which is 3. And we can see that this inequality does hold true. 0 is less than 8, which means 0 must be part of the solution. And so I'm going to shade down. You get the idea. So if you're shading with your pen or pencil, you can just do something like that to show that it's shaded in this part. So I want you guys to go ahead and try this one, and we will certainly talk more about this in class.